The moment my son, Mike, took my pension and announced it was my rent, leaving me with only $17, I was completely shocked by the betrayal. Instead of the support I had always expected, I faced a cold and calculated demand. Instead of gratitude, I felt a deep humiliation. But 3 months later, when he was forced to pay me back, everything changed. You won't believe what happened next. Mike's fist slammed onto the dinner table with such force that Emma's glass of milk tipped over, sending a white wave across the wood. The twins froze mid-bite, their chicken nuggets forgotten as they stared wide-eyed at their father's enraged face. I could hear the desperation in his voice as he told me I couldn't do this, that they needed my money. He leaned forward aggressively, his normally well-kept appearance suddenly disheveled. I remained seated, meeting his furious gaze with a calm I had been practicing for weeks. This decision wasn't a sudden one. I had been planning it since Christmas, when I watched Mike count my pension contributions like a hungry wolf eyeing its prey. I felt that 40 years of hard work was enough, and I had earned my rest. The words hung in the kitchen air, mixing with the scent of my daughter-in-law Sarah's meatloaf and the growing tension that made everyone's shoulders stiffen. Outside, Detroit's February wind rattled the frost-covered window panes, but inside our house felt even colder. Sarah's fork trembled as she carefully set it down, her nervous laugh failing to lighten the atmosphere. She thought we should discuss it after dinner, away from the children. Mike's chair scraped loudly across the floor as he stood, towering over our small dining table. He told me to listen carefully, explaining that the mortgage payment was due next week, Emma needed dental work, and Ethan's soccer registration cost $300. He asked if I really thought my Social Security would cover all of that. I watched my granddaughter's lower lip quiver as her father's voice grew louder. These innocent kids shouldn't have had to witness this breakdown, but Mike seemed beyond caring about their comfort. His financial desperation had consumed whatever paternal instincts he once had. I told him he had no right to tell me what to do. The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. His face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally, a calculating coldness that uncomfortably reminded me of his mother at her worst moments. He laughed bitterly, spreading his arms wide in theatrical disbelief. He said he had every right, since this was his house now. He reminded me that I had signed it over 2 years ago for tax purposes, and that if I stopped working, I would have to pay rent to live here. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us. Emma began to cry softly, and Ethan grabbed her hand under the table. Sarah's face had gone pale, her loyalty clearly torn between defending her husband and protecting me, her father-in-law, who had welcomed her into the family with open arms. She whispered my son's name, asking him to please reconsider, but her protest lacked any real conviction. I slowly pushed back from the table, my joints protesting after another long day at the plant. My 65 years of life had taught me to recognize when a battle could be won and when a strategic retreat was necessary. Tonight belonged to the latter. I simply said that I would be filing my retirement papers tomorrow. Without another word, I walked past my son's stunned expression and grabbed my winter coat from the hallway closet. The front door slammed behind me as I stepped into Detroit's bitter February evening, my breath forming white clouds as I began to walk down Oak Street. Behind me, I could hear Mike's muffled shouting start up again, but the distance turned his words into angry noise. The streetlights cast long shadows on the snow-covered sidewalk as I walked without a destination, my mind already focused on the steps I needed to take tomorrow. Dawn broke gray and cold over Detroit, and I woke up in my small bedroom, the echoes of Mike's threats from the previous evening still fresh in my memory. The house was silent. My son and his family were avoiding the kitchen where our confrontation had happened. I dressed quietly, pulling on my warmest sweater and gathering the manila folder I had prepared weeks ago. I had researched the bus route to the Social Security office at the federal building downtown. The DOT bus arrived at precisely 8:15, its diesel engine rumbling as other early commuters climbed aboard. An elderly woman with a walking cane smiled at me as I took the seat across from her. She observed that it was a cold morning, but assured me that spring would come eventually. My response felt somehow prophetic, as if I were speaking about more than just the weather. Detroit's urban landscape rolled past the grimy bus windows. Abandoned lots were mixed with signs of slow renewal. I saw young families walking children to school and workers hurrying toward office buildings. This city had survived bankruptcy and reinvention, so perhaps I could manage the same transformation. The federal building's security checkpoint required me to remove my belt and shoes, a process that made me feel both important and vulnerable. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over rows of plastic chairs where other seniors waited with their own manila folders and hopeful expressions. A middle-aged black woman with a kind smile and professional attire approached me. She introduced herself as Clark and said she was here for James. After I told her my name was James Wilson, she apologized for the wait. Her office was small but organized, with family photos sharing desk space with neat stacks of government forms. She gestured for me to sit across from her as she opened my file. She explained that we would start with Form SSA-1, my application for retirement insurance benefits, and that I would also need the disability report since I was applying before full retirement age. The paperwork felt overwhelming at first, but Clark's patient explanations made each section manageable. My 40-year employment history with Ford Motor Company impressed her. The documentation showed steady work, reliable income, and substantial contributions to the system. She commented that my work record was impressive and that my retirement was well-deserved. The words, "Finally, I'll be free," slipped out before I could stop them, carrying more emotional weight than I had intended. Clark's expression softened with understanding. She asked me if I was facing family pressures. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. She had probably heard similar stories from other seniors, caught between their own needs and their children's financial expectations. My phone buzzed insistently during the appointment. Mike's name appeared repeatedly on the screen, but I let each call go to voicemail. When we had finished the paperwork, I finally answered. His voice held the same desperate edge from last night's dinner confrontation, and he insisted I was making a mistake. I spoke quietly but firmly, telling him this was my life, aware that Clark was organizing my documents at her desk. She explained that processing typically takes 6 to 8 weeks and that my first payment should arrive around mid-May, assuming everything processed smoothly. The bus ride home felt different, lighter somehow, despite Mike's continued opposition. I had taken the first concrete step toward independence, and the official paperwork in my folder represented more than just retirement benefits. It symbolized me reclaiming control over my own future. Mike was waiting when I walked through the front door, his expression a mixture of anger and wounded pride. But something in my demeanor must have warned him that further arguments would be pointless. Instead, he retreated to his home office, where I could hear him making phone calls about refinancing options and second mortgages. Over the following weeks, I established a new routine. Each morning, I would hopefully check the mailbox. Each afternoon, I would walk through the neighborhood, noting which houses had for rent signs. Each evening, I would count the small savings I had accumulated in cash, hidden in my dresser drawer behind old photographs of my late wife, Mary. The waiting period tested my resolve, but it also strengthened my determination. Mike's periodic attempts to change my mind only reinforced my conviction that independence was worth whatever sacrifices it required. May 15th arrived with the kind of pleasant spring morning that makes Detroit residents forget winter's harsh grip. I had been checking the mail daily for 3 weeks, my anticipation building with each passing day. The routine had become almost ritualistic. Coffee first, then the short walk to our mailbox at the end of the driveway. Today felt different. The envelope from the Social Security Administration sat nestled between utility bills and grocery store advertisements, like a prize waiting to be claimed. My hands trembled slightly as I carried it inside, closing myself in my bedroom before carefully opening it. The check was real. It was for $1,847, made out to James Edward Wilson. It was more than I had expected. My napkin calculations over the past months had been conservative estimates. I stared at the neat printing, the official seal, the signature that made it legally valid. I whispered to the empty room that this was my money, earned through honest labor. The walk to the Chase Bank on Woodward Avenue took 20 minutes, during which I kept touching my shirt pocket to ensure the check was still safely tucked away. The morning was warm enough that I didn't need my heavy winter coat, and the lighter jacket felt symbolic of the burden lifting from my shoulders. Jennifer Lee had been my teller for nearly 15 years, watching me deposit paychecks and withdraw small amounts for household expenses. Her face brightened with genuine pleasure when she saw me approaching her window. She asked me how I was, and I told her I was better than I had been in months. I slid the check through the security glass, telling her I would like to cash it. Her eyes widened as she read the amount and saw the Social Security designation. She congratulated me on my retirement and told me I had certainly earned it. The process required additional verification for such a large cash withdrawal, but Jennifer handled everything efficiently. The counting machine's mechanical rhythm as it sorted the bills created a satisfying soundtrack to my liberation. She arranged the money in neat stacks, hundreds, fifties, and 20s that felt substantial and real in a way that electronic transfers never could. She asked if I wanted an envelope for it, and I accepted the thick manila envelope, feeling its satisfying weight as I tucked it securely into my jacket's inside pocket. The walk home passed in a blur of contentment. I called my friend Frank from a pay phone outside the corner grocery store, needing to share this moment with someone who would understand its significance. I told Frank I was finally free. He asked if I had gotten it, and if the check had actually come through. I told him it had, and that it was for $1,847, more than enough to start fresh. My voice carried a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Back home, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and carefully locked the door. The money deserved proper respect, so I counted it twice before hiding it in my dresser's bottom drawer, beneath the box of Mary's letters I had saved since her passing. The cash would remain there until I decided on my next move. Perhaps a small apartment across town, somewhere Mike's financial manipulations couldn't reach. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner and ate it in peaceful silence. Mike worked late at his office, avoiding another confrontation that might weaken his position. Sarah kept the twins occupied with homework and television, and the house maintained an artificial calm that suited my mood perfectly. Before bed, I allowed myself one last look at the hidden money. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to quiet satisfaction. I had worked 40 years for this freedom, and no one could take it away from me now. Sleep came easily for the first time in months. My dreams were filled with possibilities instead of anxieties. The weight of financial independence felt better than any pillow, and I woke the next morning ready to begin planning my escape from Mike's control. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom curtains, painting golden rectangles across the worn carpet as I stretched and smiled. Yesterday's triumph still warmed my chest. The $1,847 in crisp bills was hidden safely away from Mike's grasping hands. Today would bring planning, maybe apartment hunting, and definitely freedom. The morning felt different, somehow filled with possibilities that retirement had unlocked. Birds sang outside my window, their cheerful melodies matching my optimistic mood as I swung my legs over the bed's edge. Soon I would wake up wherever I chose, answer to no one, and spend my own money as I saw fit. My dresser drawer opened with its familiar squeak. The folded sweaters lay exactly where I had left them, undisturbed and innocent-looking. But underneath, where thick bundles of bills should have been waiting, empty space stared back at me. A crumpled $10 bill and some loose change rattled in the drawer's corner. It totaled $17 from the $1,847 I had yesterday. My hands trembled as I lifted the sweaters, shook them frantically, and searched every fold and crease for the money that wasn't there. Impossible, I whispered as I slammed the drawer shut and yanked it open again, as if the money might magically reappear. Nothing. Just that pathetic $17, mocking my stupidity. My heart hammering against my ribs, I tore through the remaining drawers. Socks, underwear, and old photographs of Mary scattered across the floor as I searched with growing desperation. Nothing was under the mattress. The spaces behind the picture frames were empty. In the closet corners, where dust bunnies collected, there wasn't a single bill. The bedroom window showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, the screen uncut. Whoever had done this had a key, knew the layout of the house, and understood exactly where to look. But who could have known about my hiding place? I checked every possible location twice, my breathing becoming ragged as reality crystallized into a cold certainty. Someone had systematically searched my room and stolen nearly $2,000 while I slept peacefully, dreaming of independence. My phone sat on the nightstand, and I reached for it instinctively to call the police to report the theft. But my hand froze halfway to the device as fragments of possibility assembled into a horrible understanding. No signs of a break-in meant it was an inside job. Only family members had access to the house overnight. Only someone who lived here could have searched so thoroughly and quietly without waking anyone. The thought hit me like ice water in my veins, but I forced myself to consider it rationally. Mike knew about my retirement money. He had made his demands clear during our dinner confrontation. When reasonable persuasion failed, had he resorted to outright theft? Downstairs, I could hear familiar morning sounds, dishes clinking, coffee brewing, children's voices preparing for school. Normal family life was continuing while my world crumbled upstairs. It was time to find answers. The sounds of breakfast drew me downstairs like a magnet. The ordinary symphony of breakfast had played every morning for the past 2 years. Sarah stood at the counter buttering toast while Emma and Ethan hurried through their cereal bowls, backpacks already positioned by their chairs for the school rush. Mike sat at the table reading yesterday's Detroit Free Press, with his coffee steaming next to his plate of scrambled eggs. When I burst through the doorway, clutching the $17 in my trembling fist, he casually looked up. He greeted me with a perfectly normal morning and asked if I had slept well. His tone carried an air of perfect normality, but a cold flicker in his eyes made my stomach clench with dread. I told him we had been robbed and that my money was gone. Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, and the children's spoons stopped moving. They sensed a crisis brewing around their innocent breakfast. But Mike calmly and deliberately folded his newspaper and set it next to his plate. He told me that no one had robbed us and that he had taken my money. His words felt like physical blows, each one driving deeper into my chest. Emma began to cry softly, and Ethan slid lower in his chair, as if trying to disappear. Sarah set down her cup with shaking hands, but didn't say anything. I wanted to know why he had done it and why he did it without my permission. Mike slowly stood up, and his height advantage suddenly felt menacing in our small kitchen. His smile had no warmth. It was a cold calculation that reminded me of a predator sizing up its wounded prey. He told me that I hadn't listened to him and reminded me of our conversation at dinner. He said he had told me what would happen if I retired. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick fold of bills, my bills. He told me that this was the rent for living in his house, and that he would take all my pension payments and give me $20 per week for personal expenses. The injustice of it all crashed over me like a wave. I told him this was my money and that he was a thief. He warned me to watch my tone, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. He counted several bills and held them out to me like scraps to a dog, saying it was $20. He thought it was generous since I wouldn't be paying for food, utilities, or housing. I reminded him that I had paid for this house for 30 years. He told me to prove it in court. Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely audible above the children's sniffling, asking Mike if they could just stay out of this. He silenced her with a look that promised consequences for her interference. Emma was now sobbing openly, and Ethan was staring at his untouched cereal, with tears streaming down his face. The children were watching their grandfather being destroyed by their father, learning lessons about power and cruelty that no child should ever have to witness. Mike tucked the money back into his pocket and went back to his breakfast as if nothing had happened. He gave me an ultimatum of $20 a week, telling me to either take it or find somewhere else to live. The ultimatum hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a house fire, poisoning everything it touched. Rage built inside my chest like steam in an overheated engine, but I forced myself to stay standing while Mike resumed eating his eggs with theatrical calmness. The children needed to leave for school. They needed to escape from this toxic demonstration of adult cruelty. Mike dismissed me, saying that if I didn't like it, I could get out of his house. He waved his fork dismissively when I started to protest again. Sarah hurried the twins toward the hallway, their school bags clutched like shields against the warfare erupting around them. Emma looked back at me with frightened eyes that broke something fundamental in my heart. I inwardly apologized to her for having to witness this. Mike finished his breakfast with deliberate slowness, checking his watch and gathering papers for work. His leather briefcase sat next to his chair, looking expensive and professional, a symbol of the success he had built on my financial foundation. He told me to think about his offer, saying that $20 a week was more than most nursing homes provided for spending money. He left for the office at exactly 9:30, kissing Sarah goodbye like any normal husband and heading to another day of honest work. The front door slammed behind him, and I heard his car start and drive away toward downtown Detroit. I waited 10 minutes before moving. Mike's bedroom adjoined the main hallway. The door was usually locked, but this morning it was standing slightly ajar. Perhaps he had grown overconfident, certain that his aged father would accept defeat without fighting back. Maybe he simply didn't expect me to have enough backbone to retaliate. His briefcase was sitting on his dresser, unlatched and inviting. Inside, beneath insurance forms and business contracts, I found a manila envelope thick with familiar bills. My money, stolen while I had been sleeping trustingly in the room above. There was $1,630 left after Mike's generous $20 allowance. I counted it twice, memorizing the exact amount for future reference, then slipped the bills into my shirt pocket. I decided to let him discover the theft when he returned from work, so he could experience the same shock and violation I had felt this morning. Upstairs, I packed quickly but thoroughly. One suitcase held my essential clothes, identification papers, and bank documents. I put Mary's photograph into my jacket pocket, close to my heart, where she had always belonged. Everything else, furniture, books, and a lifetime of domestic comforts, would stay behind. Sarah appeared in my doorway as I snapped the suitcase closed. Her face showed genuine distress, possibly the first honest emotion she had displayed in months. She pleaded with me not to go and asked if we could work something out with Mike. I told her that her husband was a thief and that there was nothing to work out. She followed me downstairs, wringing her hands and offering compromises that completely missed the fundamental point. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about my dignity, my respect, and my right to control my own life after 4 decades of honest labor. The front door opened onto Oak Street, where spring sunshine illuminated a neighborhood continuing its normal routine. Children played in yards while their mothers hung laundry and tended to their gardens. Life proceeded peacefully around my personal catastrophe, indifferent to the family destruction happening behind our house's ordinary facade. I walked away without looking back, my suitcase rolling behind me across the cracked sidewalk. 3 blocks from Oak Street, I found the Detroit Inn, a weathered brick building that advertised weekly rates and accepted cash without questions. The desk clerk barely looked up from his newspaper as I slid $45 across the scarred counter and accepted a brass key attached to a plastic diamond. Room 127 smelled of old cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, but the lock worked and the bed looked clean enough. I set my suitcase on the narrow table and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress, suddenly feeling every one of my 65 years settling into my bones like winter cold. Mary's photograph smiled at me from my wallet, the picture I had carried for 8 years since her funeral. She had been beautiful even during the cancer treatments, maintaining her dignity when everything else was falling apart, just as I was trying to do now. I thought to myself that our son had become a monster. The thought echoed in the small room, mixing with the traffic sounds from 8 Mile Road outside. I wondered how Mike had transformed from the boy who had cried in my arms after his mother's death to the man who had stolen my retirement money without a conscience. I remembered working double shifts at the Ford plant during his senior year of high school, coming home exhausted but determined to save enough for his college tuition. The guidance counselor said Mike showed promise in business management and could make something of himself with a proper education, so I had sold my car and taken the bus to work for 2 years. Every sacrifice was worth it to give him the opportunities one had never had. The college graduation photo was tucked behind Mary's picture. It showed Mike in his cap and gown, grinning beside his proud father, who had worked overtime through countless winters to make that moment possible. I had even bought him a reliable Honda for graduation that would serve him well in his first job interviews. When Mary got sick, Mike had been supportive at first, but as her medical bills mounted and my savings dwindled, he had grown distant, visiting less frequently and always seeming eager to leave. After her funeral, he had suggested I sell the house and move into senior housing, for my own good, he had claimed. Instead, I had signed the deed over to his name for tax purposes, trusting him to care for the man who had sacrificed everything for his success. The paperwork had felt like insurance against future problems, a way to keep the family home in the family. I realized what a fool I had been. Now I was sitting in a cheap motel room with $1,600 and nowhere to call home, while my son was sleeping comfortably in the house I had bought and paid for with 40 years of honest labor. The injustice burned in my chest like acid, transforming my grief into something harder and more focused. I counted the remaining money twice, which was $1,630 after tonight's room payment. It was enough to survive for several weeks if I was careful, and maybe longer if I found cheaper accommodations. But money wasn't the real issue anymore. I had had enough of being a victim. It was time to show him the real consequences. Morning light crept through the thin curtains as I made my decision. I knew there were people who helped seniors, organizations that fought against exactly what Mike had done to me. Tomorrow, I would start looking for allies in this war my son had declared. A computer terminal at the Detroit Public Library gave me exactly what I needed. The Senior Support Center on Grayson Avenue offered free legal consultations for elderly residents facing financial abuse. I found their website, and it featured testimonials from people whose children had stolen their money, manipulated their assets, or pressured them into unfavorable arrangements. Reading those stories felt like looking into a mirror, and I realized I wasn't alone in this particular form of family betrayal. 2 days of research and preparation led me to their modest brick building on a bright Tuesday morning. The manila folder under my arm contained every document I had managed to gather, including the original house deed, mortgage papers, and bank statements showing my pension deposits. My hands shook slightly as I approached the reception desk. I told the receptionist, a kindly woman in her 50s, that I was James Wilson and had a 10 a.m. appointment to see Elizabeth Harris. She smiled warmly, gestured toward a row of comfortable chairs, and told me that Elizabeth would be right with me and asked if I would like some coffee. 5 minutes later, Elizabeth Harris emerged from a side office. She was a professional woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. Her office walls displayed law degrees from Wayne State University alongside certificates in elder advocacy. She told me to tell her what had been happening. I carefully explained the situation, starting with my retirement decision and ending with Monday's confrontation in the kitchen. Elizabeth listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she reached for my folder and asked if she could examine my documents. The house deed seemed to capture her immediate attention. She studied it carefully, then turned to her computer and began typing. Her eyebrows rose as she read whatever appeared on her screen. She told me the house was registered in my name and that I was the sole owner. I told her Mike had lived there for over 10 years, ever since his mother died. She said that didn't give him any ownership rights and that what he had done was financial exploitation of an elderly person, which was a crime in Michigan. Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. She said that under Michigan law, anyone who takes advantage of a vulnerable adult's assets can face both criminal charges and civil liability. The legal terminology washed over me like cold water, shocking but somehow cleansing. I asked if I really had rights. She told me I absolutely did, and that we could demand eviction, compensation for damages, and even retroactive rent. She began pulling forms from her desk drawer, explaining that my son had essentially stolen my money and was illegally occupying my property. She said Michigan law takes elder financial abuse very seriously. For the first time in days, hope flickered in my chest. I asked her what we should do first. She said she would draft a formal demand letter requiring him to vacate the premises within 30 days and compensate me for the theft. She told me she would send it by certified mail to create a legal record. As she spoke, her pen moved across the letterhead. She added that if he refused, we could file for both criminal charges and civil recovery. The next hour passed in a blur of explanations and document preparation. Elizabeth outlined the entire process, the demand letter, the waiting period, and potential court action if Mike refused to comply. The system I had trusted for 40 years of honest work was finally protecting me instead of abandoning me. She told me that this would take time, that legal processes move slowly, and that my son might hire his own attorney. Elizabeth sealed the completed demand letter in an official envelope and asked if I was prepared for a potentially lengthy battle. I thought of Mary's photograph in my wallet, the college tuition I had sacrificed my car to pay, and Monday morning's casual cruelty over the breakfast dishes. I realized I had been preparing for this fight my whole life. I just hadn't known it. Tomorrow, we would mail the letter that would change everything. The main post office on Fort Street processed certified mail with a bureaucratic precision that perfectly suited my mood. Elizabeth stood beside me as the postal clerk attached tracking numbers and return receipt requests to the thick envelope with Mike's name and my former address. I instructed the clerk to make sure he signed for it personally, and slid the postal fees across the counter. I wanted proof that he had received every word. For days had passed since our legal consultation, and in that time, I had found a small studio apartment in Corktown and begun establishing my independent life. The place cost $600 a month, which was manageable on my pension, and it offered something the Oak Street house had never had: complete control over my own space. Elizabeth had crafted the demand letter with surgical precision, each paragraph building toward an ultimatum that would force Mike to confront the consequences of his actions. Reading it one final time before mailing felt like holding a loaded weapon. The postal worker confirmed that it should reach him by Friday afternoon and handed me the tracking receipt. Friday came and went without a response, but Saturday morning brought the return receipt in my mailbox. Mike's hasty signature confirmed the delivery at 2:47 p.m. on May 25, 2025. I imagined his expression as he read those devastating paragraphs, the slow realization that his father had found both allies and ammunition. My phone rang at exactly 11 a.m. that Saturday. It was Mike, and he asked if I was crazy, saying that this was their house. His voice carried the same dismissive tone he had used during our kitchen confrontation, but underneath I detected something new: uncertainty bordering on panic. I told him no, that this was my house, and he had 30 days. He insisted that I couldn't do this, that he had invested years in improving the property, maintaining it, and paying utilities with his money. I kept my voice level, enjoying the power shift more than I had expected. I told him that every mortgage payment, every repair, and every utility bill had come from the income one had earned or the savings I had accumulated. You've been living rent-free in my house while stealing my retirement funds. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, the bluster had evaporated. "Dad, let's talk about this reasonably. Maybe we can work out some arrangement." The arrangement is clearly outlined in the letter. 30 days to vacate, $5,000 compensation for theft and emotional distress. Keys returned to my attorney. I paused, letting each demand sink in. Those terms aren't negotiable. $5,000. I don't have that kind of money. Then you shouldn't have stolen mine. This is ridiculous. I'm calling my own lawyer. Good. Mine will enjoy explaining Michigan elder abuse statutes to yours. The conversation ended with Michael's angry disconnection, but I felt nothing except cold satisfaction. For the first time in months, someone else was scrambling to respond to my actions instead of the reverse. My studio apartment's single window faced west toward downtown Detroit, where afternoon sunlight painted the Renaissance Center's glass towers gold. Somewhere in this city, Michael was probably staring at that same letter, finally understanding that his elderly father possessed both backbone and legal representation. 30 days would pass quickly. Then we'd discover whether my son valued his stolen comfort more than avoiding criminal prosecution. Elizabeth's office buzzed with focused energy as she spread documents across her conference table like a general planning battlefield strategy. Bank statements, property deeds, and witness contact information created an impressive array of evidence that would demolish Michael's position in court. "We need to establish a clear pattern of financial abuse spanning multiple years," she explained, highlighting key transactions with her yellow marker. "Your pension deposits, his unauthorized withdrawals, utility payments you made while he claimed ownership, it all builds our case." The next 2 weeks transformed into methodical evidence gathering that felt more satisfying than any work I'd done since retiring. Mrs. Dorothy Johnson, my neighbor for 15 years, welcomed me into her kitchen with coffee and righteous indignation about Michael's behavior. "That boy always yelled at you, Mr. Wilson. We heard it through the walls, especially after his mother passed." Her weathered hands gestured emphatically while she spoke. "Never saw him do yard work or house maintenance. Always you out there in all weather, fixing things while he sat inside watching television." Frank Martinez across the street confirmed similar observations during our front porch conversation. "Michael treated you like hired help in your own home. Made my wife and me sick to watch, but we figured it was family business until now." Each witness statement strengthened our foundation, but the financial documentation provided the most damaging evidence. Bank records revealed a systematic pattern of Michael accessing my pension deposits without permission, treating my retirement income as his personal allowance while contributing nothing to household expenses. "We'll demand not only compensation but retroactive rent for 3 years." Elizabeth announced during our strategy session. Market rate for that house is $2,000 monthly. He owes you $72,000 in back rent alone. Michael's phone calls became increasingly desperate as our court date approached. His attorney had apparently explained the weakness of claiming a family arrangement without written agreements or proof of contribution to household expenses. "Dad, let's forget this nonsense and talk reasonably," he pleaded during his latest call. "Come home and we'll work something out. You started this war, son. Now face the consequences." "This is crazy. I improved that property, maintained it for years with my money using my tools while living rent-free in my house." My voice carried the cold certainty that comes from overwhelming evidence. "Your lawyer should have explained how weak your position is." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up again. When he spoke, desperation had replaced his usual arrogance. "Please, Dad, Sarah's pregnant again. We can't afford to move right now." That revelation hit like unexpected ice water, but I forced myself to remain focused on justice rather than sentiment. Michael had made his choices when he stole my retirement money. Sarah's pregnancy, while unfortunate timing, didn't excuse financial elder abuse. "You should have considered your family's needs before committing theft and fraud." Elizabeth filed our eviction papers the following Monday, requesting an expedited hearing due to elder abuse circumstances. The court clerk stamped our documents with satisfying efficiency, scheduling oral arguments for June 15th, exactly 3 weeks away. Time enough for Michael to understand that legal consequences were inevitable and for me to savor the approaching moment when justice would finally prevail. Judge Robert Clark's courtroom commanded respect with its polished wood paneling and stern portraits of previous jurists who dispensed justice from the same bench. I straightened my tie, the same navy blue one I'd worn to Mary's funeral, and took my seat beside Elizabeth at the plaintiff's table. Michael sat across the aisle with his attorney, Thomas Chun, a young lawyer who kept shuffling papers nervously and whispering urgent consultations with his clearly unprepared client. My son looked haggard, his usually pristine appearance betraying sleepless nights and mounting stress. Case number 2025, CV 8847, Wilson versus Wilson, the bailiff announced. Eviction proceedings with claims of elder financial abuse. Judge Clark reviewed our filed documents with practiced efficiency before addressing both legal teams. This case involves serious allegations of financial exploitation against an elderly parent. I expect clear evidence and professional conduct from all parties. Elizabeth rose with calm confidence, her opening statement painting a devastating picture of systematic abuse spanning 3 years. She presented bank records showing my pension deposits flowing directly into accounts Michael controlled, utility bills I'd paid, while he claimed property ownership, and maintenance receipts proving I'd funded all household expenses. The defendant has essentially stolen his father's retirement income while forcing him to live as an unpaid tenant in his own home, Elizabeth declared, her voice carrying the moral outrage I felt but couldn't express myself. Mrs. Johnson testified with passionate clarity about years of witnessed abuse. Michael screamed at his father constantly, treated him like a servant rather than the man who'd sacrificed everything for his education and success. The bank manager confirmed unauthorized access patterns, while our property appraiser established fair market rental value at $2,000 monthly. Each piece of evidence built toward an inevitable conclusion. Michael had no legal right to occupy my house and owed substantial compensation for his theft. Thomas Chin's defense crumbled under cross-examination. His claims about implied family agreements met skeptical questioning from Judge Clark, who demanded written documentation that didn't exist. "Your Honor, my client has lived in that house for over 10 years, Chin argued desperately. "Surely that establishes some form of tenancy rights." "Squatters' rights don't apply to family relationships, Counselor," Judge Clark replied dryly. "Without rental agreements or proof of compensation, your client has been living as a guest who stole from his host." When called to testify, I spoke quietly but firmly about 4 decades of honest work, the sacrifices I'd made for Michael's education, and the betrayal of having my retirement money stolen by the son I'd raised and supported. Michael's own testimony proved disastrous. Under Elizabeth's questioning, he admitted taking my money without permission, couldn't provide receipts for claimed household contributions, and eventually broke down in tears when forced to acknowledge his ingratitude. Judge Clark's verdict carried the finality of absolute justice. The evidence unequivocally proves Mr. James Wilson's property ownership. Defendant's actions qualify as financial exploitation of an elderly person under Michigan Statute MCL 750-174A. Eviction within 60 days. Compensation of $10,000 for emotional distress. Retroactive rent of $72,000 for 3 years of unauthorized occupancy. Michael's anguished cry echoed through the courtroom as the gavel fell, but I felt only quiet satisfaction. After months of humiliation and betrayal, the legal system had vindicated my dignity and restored my rights. Justice, it seemed, was worth the wait. August sunlight streamed through my kitchen window. My kitchen in my house, restored to its rightful owner after months of legal battle. The morning coffee tasted sweeter, somehow, brewed in familiar surroundings that finally belonged to me again, without question or compromise. 2 months had passed since Judge Clark's verdict, and Michael's court-ordered payments arrived punctually on the first of each month. Chase Bank's automated notification system chimed pleasantly whenever his electronic transfer appeared in my account. $2,000 that represented both justice served and lessons learned. The house bore fresh improvements that reflected my tastes rather than accommodating someone else's preferences. Mary's photographs occupied places of honor throughout rooms painted in colors we'd chosen together decades ago. The garden bloomed with flowers she'd loved, tended by hands that finally had time to nurture growing things instead of working double shifts. Mr. Wilson, another transfer received from Michael Wilson. Jennifer Lee informed me during my weekly bank visit. Right on schedule as usual. Justice has finally been served. I replied, endorsing the deposit slip with a satisfaction that never seemed to diminish. My retirement had transformed from a nightmare into an adventure. Florida beckoned with winter warmth and old friends from the Ford plant, who'd retired years earlier. The Senior Support Center welcomed my volunteer hours, helping other elderly victims navigate legal systems designed to protect their rights and dignity. Photography classes at Detroit Community College filled Tuesday evenings with creative pursuits I'd postponed for 40 years. My instructor, a patient woman named Carol, praised my eye for composition while helping me develop techniques for capturing Detroit's urban renewal alongside its persistent character. The social calendar at the Senior Center introduced possibilities I hadn't considered: bridge tournaments, book clubs, and carefully orchestrated dinner gatherings where conversation flowed easier than I'd expected. Margaret O'Brien, a widow from the photography class, shared my appreciation for quiet museums and afternoon concerts at the Detroit Symphony. Michael called on Labor Day weekend, his voice carrying a humility that replaced his former arrogance. Dad, please forgive me. I understand now what I put you through. You taught me to be strong, Michael. Now pay for the lesson. The payments aren't the problem anymore. It's knowing I destroyed our relationship for money I didn't even need that badly. His transformation seemed genuine, but trust would require years to rebuild. Sarah had found work as a medical receptionist. Their new apartment in Highland Park was modest but adequate, and the children were learning valuable lessons about earning rather than taking what they needed. Perhaps we can have coffee sometime, I offered carefully, on neutral ground with no expectations except conversation. I'd like that, Dad. I'd like that very much. Evening light painted my renovated kitchen gold as I prepared dinner for one, a meal chosen for taste rather than budget, cooked in my own time, without pressure or interference. The telephone rang occasionally with social invitations, travel opportunities, or simply friends checking on my well-being. Tomorrow would bring another photography expedition with Carol, then lunch at the Senior Center, where my advice helped other families navigate similar battles. Next month promised Florida sunshine and reunions with colleagues who'd retired before family obligations trapped me in patterns of sacrifice and enabling. Mary's photographs smiled from the windowsill, surrounded by flowers that bloomed because I finally had time to tend them properly. Somewhere across town, Michael was learning to live within his means, while honoring debts to the father he'd betrayed. The balance felt exactly right. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to second chances, hard-won justice, and the sweet satisfaction of reclaiming a life I'd thought was lost forever. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.